The ceiling fan stopped mid-rotation at 6:47 p.m., and the hum I hadn't realized was keeping me company vanished like a held breath finally released. I was standing in my kitchen with a half-sliced onion on the cutting board, the knife still in my hand, when the world went quiet, not the gentle quiet of a Sunday afternoon, the abrupt, surgical quiet of something severed. The refrigerator ceased its low rumble. The microwave clock blinked once and died, the ambient electric pulse that lived beneath every moment of modern life. That invisible scaffolding we never acknowledge until it collapses was gone. I set the knife down and wiped my hands on a dish towel. Power outages weren't unusual in my part of Ridgemont. The neighborhood sat on the tail end of a grid that served 3 suburbs and a commercial strip, and any decent thunderstorm could knock us off for an hour or two. But this wasn't storm season. The sky outside my kitchen window was a clean gradient of fading orange and deepening blue, not a cloud in sight. I checked my phone. Full signal, no alerts, no weather warnings. Just the time, 6:47. And a notification from a food delivery app I never used. I tried the light switch by the hallway. Nothing. Walked to the breaker box in the garage and toggled the main. Nothing. I stepped outside and looked down Maple Lane. Every house was dark. The Hendersons' porch light, which burned from dusk until dawn regardless of season, was off. The streetlights hadn't come on. Even the traffic signal at the end of the block, visible from my driveway, was black. I texted my neighbor, Diane. She lived 2 doors down and always knew what was happening before the news did. Retired dispatcher, scanner hobbyist, the kind of woman who heard sirens and could tell you the station, the unit number, and whether it was a false alarm before the truck turned the corner. My message was simple. Power out here too? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Whole grid, she wrote back. Called the utility. Automated message says they're aware and working on it. But Marcus down at the fire station says they're getting calls from as far as Linden. That's 2 counties. 2 counties. That wasn't a transformer. That wasn't a downed line. I stood in my driveway and turned in a slow circle. The stillness was wrong. I couldn't name why. There was no wind, no dog barking, no distant television bleeding through a neighbor's window. The absence was layered, as though multiple systems had failed simultaneously and taken the ambient noise of civilization with them. I went back inside. My phone sat at 63%. I plugged it into the portable charger I kept in my desk drawer and set it on the kitchen counter. I finished slicing the onion by the last slant of daylight, scraped the pieces into a skillet that would never heat, and laughed at myself. Then I ate crackers and peanut butter standing at the sink, watching the sky drain its last color. By 7:30, I'd gathered candles. 3 tapered ones from a dinner party I'd hosted months ago. A jar candle from the bathroom that smelled like cedar. A half-melted pillar I found in the junk drawer alongside batteries, twist ties, and a warranty card for a blender I no longer owned. I set them around the living room like small altars. Their light did something strange to the walls, turned my home into a place I didn't fully recognize. Familiar geometry rendered in unfamiliar shadow. I sat on the couch and opened a group chat with my sister, Ellen, and my friend Marcus. Not the Marcus from the fire station, a different one. My Marcus, Marcus Oyelaran. We'd been friends since college, lived 40 minutes apart, spoke in bursts of memes and voice notes. Anybody else sitting in the dark? I typed. Ellen responded first. We still have power in Greendale. You okay? Marcus sent a voice note. I pressed play and heard him chewing something. Bro, Your side of town is always falling apart. Come crash here if it lasts. I considered it. 40 minutes wasn't far. But something about the darkness outside my window, the completeness of it, made me reluctant to leave. There was a gravitational pull to staying put, as though the house itself was asking me not to go. I told Marcus I'd ride it out, told Ellen I was fine, put the phone down and listened to the candles hiss. At 8:15, Diane texted again. Hearing strange chatter on the scanner. Medical calls spiking in the eastern corridor. 5 ambulances dispatched in 20 minutes. Might be unrelated. I read the message twice. Then I locked the front door. By 9 o'clock, I had arranged my home into something resembling a functional space. Flashlight on the kitchen counter aimed at the ceiling to cast a wide, ambient glow. Candles stationed in each room I might need to enter. Cooler dragged from the garage and packed with the perishables from the fridge. Milk, leftover chicken, a bag of shredded cheese that had been optimistically purchased for tacos I'd never made. The freezer I left sealed, hoping the cold would hold until morning. I was halfway through filling a water jug from the tap. Still running, still pressurized, when the first siren cut through the silence. It was far off, maybe 3 or 4 blocks south, and it passed through the neighborhood like a needle through fabric, quick and clean. I waited for the sound to dissolve. It didn't. Another siren joined from the west, then a third from somewhere I couldn't place. And suddenly the silence that had blanketed Ridgemont since the power died was peeled back to reveal something frantic underneath. I went to the living room window and parted the blinds. Nothing moved on Maple Lane. The houses remained dark, their silhouettes fixed against a moonless sky. But the sirens continued, overlapping, directionless, multiplying. They weren't converging on a single point. They were spreading. My phone buzzed. Diane again. Scanner is going crazy. They're calling all units. I've never heard it like this. Something about a containment protocol. They're using terminology I don't recognize. I called her. She picked up on the first ring, and her voice, Diane's steady, laconic, unimpressed voice, carried an unfamiliar tremor. I've been listening for 30 years, she said. I know every code, every signal, every shorthand those dispatchers use. But they're saying things I've never heard. Phrases that sound medical, but aren't in any protocol I've seen. And the volume. It's not a disaster response. It's something else. It sounds like they're scared. I asked her what she thought was happening. I don't know. But I locked my doors, and I suggest you do the same. I had already locked mine. I checked anyway. Front door dead-bolted. Back door locked and chained. Garage door down and latched. I drew every curtain and blind. Then I sat in the middle of my living room, surrounded by candlelight, and listened to the sirens multiply. At 9:20, the internet died. Not gradually, not a slow decay of signal strength, but instantly, as though someone had reached into the infrastructure and pulled a plug. My phone still had cellular, but it was sluggish. Pages wouldn't load. The group chat with Ellen and Marcus showed my last message delivered but unread. I tried calling Ellen. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. I tried Marcus. Straight to voicemail. I opened Twitter. The feed was a frozen snapshot from 20 minutes ago. Someone had posted about the power outage. A joking tweet from a college student in Ridgemont about studying by candlelight. Below it, a local news account had posted a brief alert. Widespread power outage affecting Ridgemont, Linden, and portions of Greater Ashford. Utility companies investigating. No estimated restoration time. I refreshed. Nothing loaded. I refreshed again. The loading circle spun, caught, and stopped. I set the phone on the coffee table and pressed my palms together. The sirens hadn't stopped. If anything, they had thickened into a constant, low-level wail that had lost its urgency and become ambient. The new background hum replacing the electrical one that had been severed hours ago. Then, at 9:34, I heard something that wasn't a siren. It came from outside. Down the street, maybe 4 or 5 houses away. A scream. Not a shout or a yelp. A scream that started in one register and climbed to another. A sound that the human throat only produces when the body has exhausted every other response. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5, and then it stopped. I stood up. The candle flames bent in unison, though I couldn't feel a draft. I went to the window and pressed my face to the glass between the blinds. There was a figure on the Hendersons' lawn. I could see it because the Hendersons had a white gravel border around their garden beds, and the figure was standing on it. And in the darkness, the contrast was just enough to make out a shape. It wasn't moving the way people move. Its posture was wrong, hunched forward, head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck had surrendered its structural role. It stood there on the gravel and swayed. I watched for 30 seconds. The figure didn't leave. It didn't call out. It simply occupied the space with a patience that felt inhuman. I stepped back from the window, and my heel caught the leg of the coffee table. The ceramic mug I'd left there, the one with cold coffee from that afternoon, tipped, hit the hardwood floor, and shattered. The figure on the Hendersons' lawn turned toward my house. I dropped below the windowsill. My breathing was loud and sudden, and I pressed my hand over my mouth as though I could physically contain the sound. The shattered mug was scattered around my feet in sharp arcs. A piece had nicked my ankle, and I could feel a thin line of warmth running into my sock. But I didn't move. I stayed crouched beneath that window and counted my heartbeats until they slowed from a gallop to a canter. When I finally raised my head and peered through the blinds again, the figure was gone. Not gone in the way a person leaves. Walking down the sidewalk, opening a car door, retreating to their own yard. Gone in the way that a shadow disappears when the light source shifts. The Hendersons' white gravel border was empty. I scanned the length of the street, left to right, and saw nothing. The sirens had faded to a single, distant wail that rose and fell like mechanical breathing. I cleaned up the mug with a dish towel, picking each shard out carefully, pressing my fingertips against the floor to catch the smallest fragments. The ritual of it steadied me. I needed tasks. I needed small, manageable actions that kept my hands busy and my thoughts from spiraling. I tied the towel around the broken pieces and set it on the counter. Then I went through the house room by room. The bathroom window faced the backyard, and through it I could see the fence line and the row of arborvitae that separated my property from the Nguyens behind me. Nothing moved. The spare bedroom looked out onto the side yard, where my trash cans stood in a neat row beside the gate. I checked the lock on the window. Painted shut, hadn't opened in years. Good. My bedroom faced the street, like the living room, but from the second floor. I stood to the side and angled my vision down. That's when I saw the second one. It was in the middle of the road, directly beneath where the streetlight should have been. A woman, or what had been a woman. She was wearing a nightgown, pale fabric that caught whatever ambient light the sky still held. Her feet were bare. She was walking, but the motion was disjointed, as though each step was a separate decision made by a brain that had lost its rhythm. She moved in a loose, wandering line, crossing from one side of the road to the other, pausing, turning, resuming. I recognized the nightgown. Mrs. Calloway. She lived at the end of the block. 72 years old, kept a garden that won the Neighborhood Association Award every spring, brought me zucchini bread in August because her plants produced more than she could eat. She'd always had a slight stoop, a careful way of moving that suggested her hips weren't cooperative. But this wasn't that. This was something else wearing her posture badly. She stopped in the road and stood still. Then she tilted her head back and opened her mouth and made a sound I will never be able to scrub from my memory. It was low and continuous, a moan that had no emotional content, no pain, no sorrow, no anger. Just a vibration passing through vocal cords that were still technically functional, but no longer connected to anything that understood language. I stepped back from the window. My phone buzzed on the coffee table downstairs. I moved down the staircase in the dark, one hand on the railing, each step deliberate. The phone screen glowed against the ceiling. Diane had sent a single message at 9:41 p.m. No text, just a link. I tapped it. The browser struggled, loaded in fragments, and finally delivered a page from the County Emergency Management website. A page I'd never seen before, formatted in red and white, with a single block of text. Shelter in place. Do not leave your home. Do not open doors for any person. Do not approach individuals displaying erratic behavior. This is not a drill. Additional information will follow. There was no additional information. The page ended there. I scrolled down and found only white space. I sat on the bottom step of my staircase and read the message 4 more times. Each reading added weight. Do not open doors for any person. Not for strangers, for any person. The phrasing was deliberate, and its deliberateness was the most frightening thing I'd encountered all night. I thought about Diane, 2 doors down, alone in her house with her scanner and her locked doors. I thought about the Hendersons, whose porch light never came on. I thought about Mrs. Calloway, standing in the road in her nightgown, tilting her head toward the empty sky and moaning into the void. I turned off my phone to save battery, blew out the candles, sat in total darkness on my staircase and listened to the night breathe around me. The sirens had stopped entirely now. The silence that replaced them was worse. It was a silence that had things moving inside it, and I could hear them. Faint sounds at the edge of perception. A shuffle, a scrape. Something brushing against the siding of a house that might have been mine. I did not sleep. I sat on that staircase with my back against the wall and my hand on the banister, and waited for the world to tell me what it had become. Dawn arrived without ceremony. There was no bird song. I noticed this first, the absence of the sparrows that usually colonize the maple tree in my front yard, and announced every morning like an unrequested alarm. The light crept through the curtains in thin gray lines, and I peeled myself off the staircase where I'd spent the night in a half-conscious vigil, my neck stiff, my lower back announcing its displeasure with every vertebra. I went to the kitchen and turned the faucet. Water came, still pressurized, still clear. I filled a glass and drank it standing at the sink, looking at the backyard through the window above the basin. The yard was empty. The arborvitae stood motionless. The Nguyen's roofline was visible above the fence, and their chimney stack looked exactly as it always did. For a moment, everything appeared normal. A suburban morning, slightly overcast, power still out. Then I noticed the back gate was open. I always latched that gate. It was a compulsion inherited from my mother, who'd grown up on a property where an unlatched gate meant livestock in the road. The gate opened inward, and it was standing at roughly 45 degrees, revealing a wedge of the alley that ran behind the houses on Maple Lane. Through that wedge, I could see a garbage can on its side, its contents, takeout containers, a crushed soda box, scattered across the gravel. I did not go to the gate. I backed away from the window and checked every entrance again. Front door, still bolted. Back door, still chained. The chain was a short brass affair I'd installed myself, and it wouldn't stop a determined intruder, but it was intact. The garage door was down. The side door from the garage to the yard was locked, with a padlock I kept on a hook beside the water heater. I turned on my phone. 11% battery. I'd forgotten to keep it on the portable charger through the night. The screen loaded slowly, then delivered a cascade of notifications. 14 missed calls. 3 from Ellen, 4 from Marcus, 7 from numbers I didn't recognize. A text from Ellen at 2:17. I'm Melwem. Please call me, please. Something is happening and I need to know you're okay. A text from Marcus at 3:04. Sam. Bro, where are you? They're saying it's a virus. Turn on the news. If you have power, turn on the news. I didn't have power. I didn't have news. I had 11% battery and a growing awareness that the world outside my walls had changed while I sat in the dark. I called Ellen. The line connected on the second ring, and her voice was raw, the way it sounded after she'd been crying for a long time and had stopped, but the evidence remained. Oh, thank God, she said. Thank God. Are you okay? Are you hurt? I told her I was fine. I asked her what was happening. It's everywhere, she said. Her words came fast, tumbling. It started in the eastern part of the state. Some kind of infection. They were calling it a pathogen on the news. Then they stopped using that word and started saying outbreak. The infected, they change. They don't die, not right away, but they change. They become aggressive. They bite. And anyone who gets bitten starts changing too. It spreads through contact. I sank into a kitchen chair. The room felt like it was tilting. They shut down the highways around midnight, Ellen continued. National Guard is deployed. The governor declared a state of emergency at 1 a.m. But the power, that was the first thing to go. They think someone attacked the grid, or it overloaded. Nobody's sure. I asked her if Greendale was safe. For now, we still have power. Tom boarded the windows this morning. Tom was her husband, an electrician with a practical streak that I'd always found slightly excessive, but now seemed prophetic. But they're saying it's moving west, toward you. I looked at my kitchen. The uncooked onion, the crackers, the cooler packed with food that was already beginning to warm. My world had contracted to this. 4 walls, diminishing supplies, and a sister's voice telling me that everything beyond those walls was collapsing. Stay inside, Ellen said. Don't open the door for anyone. I'll come get you when it's safe. I told her to stay in Greendale. I told her I'd be fine. I hung up before she could argue, because my phone was at 8%, and because I heard something at the back door. A gentle, exploratory pressure, like someone leaning against it to test whether it would give. The pressure against the back door lasted for 12 seconds. I counted them. Each second was a continent. I stood in the kitchen, 3 feet from the door, and watched the chain pull taut against the frame. The wood around the chain mount groaned, a soft, organic sound, like a tree branch bending in wind. Then the pressure stopped. I heard footsteps on the back porch, not walking away, circling, moving along the length of the porch to the left, where the kitchen window sat above the sink. I dropped to my knees. The window was low, barely chest height when standing, and the curtains were thin, cotton things that filtered light but didn't block it. If whatever was on the porch looked in, it would see the kitchen, the candles, the cooler, every sign that someone was home. I crawled across the kitchen floor to the counter and reached up to grab the largest knife from the block. A chef's knife, 8 inches, well maintained because I actually enjoyed cooking and believed in sharp tools. Holding it didn't make me feel safer. It made the situation real in a way that the sirens and the emergency page and Ellen's phone call hadn't. This was a knife in my hand, in my kitchen, because something was outside my window. The footsteps stopped. I waited. 1 minute, 2, 3. Then a sound from the front of the house. A dull impact against the front door, like a fist thrown without purpose, and then nothing. I stayed on the floor for another 20 minutes. When I finally rose, my knees were imprinted with the tile pattern, and my hand had cramped around the knife handle. I set it on the counter but didn't put it back in the block. I checked the back porch through the window, standing to the side, angling my view. Nothing. The porch was empty. But on the railing, I could see marks, smears of something dark against the white painted wood. I couldn't tell what it was from inside, and I wasn't going to open the door to find out. I spent the next hour making my house harder to enter. I dragged the bookshelf from the living room and pushed it against the front door. 45 minutes of effort for a barricade that probably wouldn't stop anyone truly determined. But the labor was its own reward. I moved the kitchen table against the back door and wedged it under the chain. I closed every interior door on the first floor, creating compartments. If something got in, it would have to open doors to find me. And doors were noise, and noise was warning. At 8:30 a.m., I heard knocking. Real knocking. A human rhythm. 3 sharp raps, a pause, 3 more. It came from the side door of the garage. I approached through the laundry room, which connected the main house to the garage. The padlock was still in place. I pressed my ear to the door. "Hello?" A man's voice, shaking. "Please, if anyone's in there. I need help. I'm not one of them. Please." I didn't answer immediately. I stood with my forehead against the door and felt the wood vibrate with his next round of knocking. The voice was young, maybe early 20s. The tremor in it was genuine. Not the theatrics of desperation, but the thin, reedy quality of someone whose adrenaline had been running for hours and was approaching empty. "My name is Jay," the voice said. "I live on Birch Street. I've been walking since 3 a.m. I just need water. I haven't seen anyone alive since I left my apartment." I opened the laundry room door and stepped into the garage. Through the small, dust-filmed window in the side door, I could see a face. Young, dark-skinned, wearing a hoodie with the strings pulled tight. His eyes were wide and scanning constantly. Left, right, behind him. The vigilance of prey. I unlocked the padlock, opened the door 6 inches, looked at him, looked at his hands. Empty. Looked at his neck, his arms, any visible skin. "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No, I ran. I just ran." I opened the door the rest of the way and pulled him inside. His name was Jalen Carter. He was 23, a graduate student at the community college, 8 blocks north. He'd been in his apartment when the power went out, and he'd stayed there through the sirens, through the screams, through the sounds of his upstairs neighbor thrashing against furniture, until the thrashing stopped and was replaced by a wet, rhythmic thumping against the floor that he couldn't make himself investigate. At 3 a.m., the thumping stopped too, and the silence drove him out. He'd walked south in the dark, staying in alleys, ducking behind cars, breathing through his mouth to stay quiet. I gave him water and 2 granola bars and let him sit on the garage floor with his back against my workbench. He drank the water in one continuous pull, then looked at the empty glass as though he expected it to refill itself. They're everywhere, he said. Not clustered, spread out, walking, just walking. I passed maybe 15 on the way here, and none of them were together. They don't group up. They just wander. I asked him if any of them had noticed him. 2 did. I ran. They followed, but they're slow. Not fast, zombie slow. Shuffle slow. But they don't stop. They don't get tired. I had to climb a fence and wait on someone's roof for 20 minutes before one of them lost interest. I looked at this stranger sitting on my garage floor, and I made a decision that would define the next several days of my life. I told him he could stay. Jay slept on my couch for 4 hours while I kept watch from the upstairs bedroom window. I'd given him a blanket and a pillow and told him the bathroom was down the hall. And he'd nodded with the mechanical gratitude of someone too exhausted for real emotion. He was asleep within minutes, his breathing deep and steady, his sneakers still on. I didn't take them off. That felt like a boundary I shouldn't cross with someone I'd known for 15 minutes. From the second floor, I had a better vantage point. Maple Lane stretched in both directions, a gentle curve of single-family homes, mature trees, parked cars that hadn't moved in 14 hours. In the full light of morning, the street looked almost normal. Almost. The differences revealed themselves slowly, the way your eyes adjust to a hidden image puzzle, and suddenly the embedded shape becomes impossible to unsee. The Hendersons' front door was open, not ajar. Fully open, the interior visible as a dark rectangle. Their car was still in the driveway. A garden hose lay across their walkway, still attached to the spigot, as though someone had been watering the lawn when they were interrupted and never returned. 3 houses down, a window was broken on the second floor. The curtain had been pulled outward through the jagged opening and hung limp against the exterior wall, like a flag of surrender. At the far end of the street, where Maple Lane met Crescent Drive, a car had been left in the intersection. Its driver's door was open, and something about the angle of its wheels, cranked hard to the left, as though the driver had been mid-turn, suggested abandonment rather than parking. Nobody abandons a car in an intersection without reason. I watched for movement and found it at 11:15. A figure emerged from between 2 houses on the opposite side of the street. It was a man, tall, heavy-set, wearing a polo shirt that was untucked and stained. He walked into the middle of the road and stopped. His head moved in slow, sweeping arcs, scanning without seeing. Then he turned and walked directly into a parked car. Not around it, into it. His thighs hit the bumper, and he stood there, pressing against the vehicle with a dull, sustained effort, as though he couldn't process the obstacle. After about 30 seconds, he sidestepped and continued walking, resuming the same aimless trajectory. I cataloged this. They were slow. They didn't navigate obstacles well. They responded to sound. I'd seen that with the mug the night before. They wandered individually. Jay had confirmed they didn't tire. These were data points, and data points were useful because they replaced fear with analysis. Fear paralyzed. Analysis planned. Jay woke at noon, groggy and disoriented. He sat up on the couch and looked around my living room as though trying to reconcile where he was with where he'd expected to be. I came downstairs and handed him another glass of water and a can of tuna I'd opened with the manual opener from the drawer. "We need to talk about supplies," I said. He ate the tuna with a fork, straight from the can, and nodded. I'd already taken inventory. The results were not encouraging. In the kitchen, a partial bag of rice, 2 cans of black beans, the tuna, a jar of peanut butter, half a loaf of bread that was beginning to stale, assorted condiments, a bag of apples, and the contents of the cooler, which had maybe 12 more hours before everything inside became unsafe. In the bathroom, basic first aid supplies, a half-used bottle of ibuprofen, hydrogen peroxide, bandages. In the garage, tools, a camping lantern with limited fuel, a roll of duct tape, rope, and a 5-gallon gas can that was roughly 2/3 full. That's maybe 4 days for 2 people, I said. 5 if we stretch it. Jay set down the tuna can. What about water? Tap's still running. I've been filling everything I can. Pots, jugs, the bathtub. If the water system runs on electric pumps, we might lose pressure once the backup generators fail. He looked at me with an expression I would come to know well over the following days, a mix of respect and alarm at how quickly I'd adapted to thinking in these terms. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't calm, that my hands had been shaking since 6 o'clock the previous evening, that the inventory was a coping mechanism, not a competency. But there wasn't time for that kind of honesty. There was only the arithmetic of survival. Calories, water, barriers, threats. We stay quiet, I said. We stay inside. We wait for the military or the government or whoever's supposed to handle this. And we conserve everything. Jay agreed. He didn't have a better plan. Neither did I. But having a bad plan felt infinitely better than having none. On the second day, the water pressure dropped by half. I'd been right about the pumps. The flow from the faucet went from a stream to a trickle, and by afternoon it was a slow, intermittent drip that yielded a cup every 10 minutes. I set every container I owned beneath it. A saucepot, a mixing bowl, a flower vase I'd never used, and let them fill with agonizing patience. The bathtub held roughly 40 gallons. I'd filled it the night before, and it sat there like a liquid savings account, still and reflective. I calculated consumption. 2 people, moderate activity, warm weather. 1 gallon per person per day at minimum. We had perhaps 10 days of water if we were disciplined. But discipline erodes. Thirst is not a polite adversary. It doesn't negotiate. Jay had settled into the house with the adaptive speed of someone who understood that attachment to normal was a luxury we couldn't afford. He organized the food into a system. Breakfast items, dinner items, snacks that could bridge the gaps, and set daily portions that were precise enough to be annoying but necessary. He'd done food bank volunteering in college, he told me, and had learned the mechanics of stretching resources from the women who ran the distribution center. Mrs. Patterson used to say that hunger is manageable, but panic about hunger is not, he said, portioning rice into mason jars. So you measure, you count, you show yourself the plan, and the plan keeps the panic quiet. I liked Jay. I liked his calm practicality, his willingness to work without being asked, his habit of narrating his actions under his breath. Okay, rice in the jar, lid on, next one. As though the narration was part of the process. He reminded me of the kind of student I'd been in my early 20s, diligent, slightly nervous, eager to prove useful. He was handling the end of the world better than I was, though neither of us would have admitted it. On the second afternoon, we heard voices. Not the moaning I'd heard the first night. Real voices, human voices, coming from the direction of Crescent Drive. Jay and I went upstairs and looked out from the bedroom window. 3 people were walking up the middle of the street. A man and 2 women, moving quickly, carrying bags. They were alive. Obviously, unmistakably alive. Their movements purposeful, their heads turning with awareness, their bodies responding to the environment with 1,000 small adjustments that separated the living from whatever the others had become. Jay grabbed my arm. We should signal them. I hesitated. The shelter-in-place order was still the most recent guidance I'd received. Do not open doors for any person. But that order had been issued by a system that might no longer exist. The emergency management website hadn't updated. The phone networks were down entirely now. My phone had become an expensive clock showing 4:23 p.m. with no signal and 12% battery from careful charging on the portable unit. I went to the window and opened it 2 inches. "Hey," I called, keeping my voice low but carrying. "Up here." The 3 of them stopped. The man, thin, mid-30s, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled, looked up and found my window. "Are you alone?" he asked. "2 of us. We've been here since the outage." He looked at the 2 women beside him. One was older, gray-haired, clutching a duffel bag with both hands. The other was younger, maybe Jay's age, with a bandage wrapped around her left forearm. The bandage was clean, white gauze, neatly applied. But its presence raised a question that I couldn't ignore. "What happened to her arm?" I asked. The younger woman looked up at me. "I cut it on a fence climbing over. It's not a bite. I swear to you, it's not a bite." Her eyes were clear. Her voice was steady. The older woman beside her, her mother, I would learn, held her closer and looked at me with an expression that contained every maternal terror compressed into a single glance. "Please," the man said. "We've been walking for 6 hours. We need to rest." I looked at Jay. He was already heading for the stairs. We let them in through the garage, the same way Jay had entered. The man was Nolan Reed, a high school science teacher from the eastern side of Ridgemont. The older woman was Patricia Okafor, and the younger woman with the bandaged arm was her daughter, Amara. They'd been sheltering in Nolan's school when the infected had breached the gymnasium doors, and they'd fled west on foot, navigating by street signs and fear. 5 people in my house. The math changed instantly. 10 days of water became 4. 5 days of food became 2. The plan Jay and I had built, careful, measured, sustainable, was suddenly insufficient. And we hadn't even opened the door by choice. We'd opened it because the alternative was watching 3 living people stand in a street full of the dead and pretending we couldn't see them. Nolan set his bag down in the living room and pulled out a battery-powered radio. He turned it on, and static filled the room. He scanned through frequencies. White noise, white noise, white noise. Until, on the AM band, we caught a fragment of a broadcast. A voice, official and rehearsed, repeating a loop. "Proceed to designated evacuation points. Military escort will be provided. Repeat. Proceed to designated evacuation points." No locations, no coordinates. No indication of where these points were or whether they still existed. Nolan turned the dial. More static. Then nothing. The batteries were weak, and the signal was weaker. He turned it off and set it on the coffee table beside the dead ceramic fragments of my mug that I still hadn't swept up. "That broadcast has been running since last night," he said. "Same loop, same words. I don't think anyone's behind it anymore. I think it's automated." The first real argument happened on the 3rd morning. It started with rice. Jay had portioned the remaining rice into servings based on 2 people. When Nolan saw the jars lined up on the counter, he did the math himself and pointed out that the current allocation wouldn't last through the next day. "We need to reduce portions," Nolan said. He said it the way teachers say things, with an implicit expectation of compliance that comes from years of commanding classrooms. It was authoritative without being aggressive, and under normal circumstances, it would have been received as reasonable. These were not normal circumstances. "We already reduced portions," Jay said. His voice was tight. He'd built the system. The jars were his work. The labels, written in marker on strips of masking tape, were his handwriting. The challenge felt personal because it was personal. I've been stretching this since day one. I'm not criticizing, Nolan said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm stating a fact. 5 mouths, 2 days of food. That's a problem that doesn't solve itself by hoping. Amara was sitting at the kitchen table, flexing her bandaged hand open and closed. Her mother stood behind her, one hand on Amara's shoulder, watching the two men with the practiced neutrality of someone who had raised a child through every kind of conflict and knew that intervention required timing. "So, what do you suggest?" I asked. I was standing between them, leaning against the counter, holding a mug of water that I was nursing like whiskey. Nolan looked at me directly. "We go out, not far. The houses on the street are empty. I've watched them. Nobody's come or gone. If the owners evacuated or didn't make it, their kitchens are stocked. We hit 2 or 3 houses, take what's shelf-stable, bring it back." Jay shook his head. "I walked through those streets at 3 in the morning. There are infected out there. Scattered, slow, but present. Going outside is a risk. Staying inside is also a risk. Starvation is slower than a bite, but the result is the same." The room went quiet. Amara stopped flexing her hand. Patricia's grip on her daughter's shoulder tightened. I felt the gravity of the decision settle over the kitchen like a physical weight. This was the moment. I recognized it even as it was happening, where our group would either cohere around a shared strategy or fracture into competing survival philosophies. "I'll go," I said. Both of them looked at me. I know this neighborhood. I know which houses have side entries. I know which ones have dogs, or had dogs, and which ones are single story. I can move through 3 houses in 20 minutes and be back before anything notices. Jay protested. Nolan supported it. Patricia, speaking for the first time since the argument began, said, "If you go, don't go alone. A second person watches while the first person searches. That's not heroism. That's geometry." She was right. The question was, who would come with me? Jay volunteered before Nolan could. I think he needed to prove that his reluctance wasn't cowardice, that he could argue against a plan and still execute it. We agreed to go at midday, when the light was strongest and visibility was maximized. Jay took the chef's knife. I took a claw hammer from the garage. We wore sneakers, dark clothes, and moved toward the back door with the cautious choreography of 2 people who had never done anything like this and were improvising every step. I removed the table from the back door, unhooked the chain, turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock disengaging sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. The back porch was empty. The smears I'd seen on the railing 2 days earlier had dried to a dark, rust-colored residue. The yard was still. The arborvitae wall was intact. I stepped outside and felt sunlight on my face for the first time in 60 hours. And the warmth of it was so ordinary, so purely pleasant, that for one disorienting second, I forgot why I was holding a hammer. Jay stepped out behind me. We crossed the yard to the back gate, still open, still unexplained, and entered the alley. The gravel crunched beneath our feet, and every crunch felt amplified, broadcast, announced. We moved to the Hendersons' back gate. Their yard was neat, trimmed, the garden beds mulched and orderly. The back door was unlocked. Inside, the Henderson house was dark and still. The layout was a mirror of mine. Kitchen to the left, living room ahead, stairs to the right. I went straight for the pantry. Canned soup, canned corn, a box of pasta, crackers, a jar of olives that no one would want, but everyone would eat if it came to that. I loaded everything into the backpack I'd brought. Jay stood at the kitchen window, watching the alley. "Clear," he whispered. "Clear, still clear." We moved to the next house, then the next. In 22 minutes, we had enough food for a week. We also had information. 2 of the 3 houses we entered showed signs of hasty evacuation. Drawers left open, shoes scattered by the door, a purse on the kitchen table with its contents spilled as though someone had grabbed it in a rush. The 3rd house, the Calloway residence, showed something different. The kitchen chair was overturned. There was a stain on the linoleum that I recognized as blood, even in the dim light. Mrs. Calloway's zucchini bread pan sat on the counter, clean and dry, waiting for a recipe that would never be made. We returned through the alley, through the gate, through the yard, through the back door. I locked everything behind us. Nolan helped unpack the supplies. Patricia organized them without being asked. Amara watched from the table with an expression that was impossible to read. Relief, guilt, exhaustion, all layered behind dark eyes that had seen too much in too few days. We ate canned soup that night, cold from the can, shared among 5. It tasted like a miracle. On the 4th day, Amara's bandage began to smell. I noticed it first because I'd been sleeping on the living room floor, and Amara had been given the couch. And in the early morning stillness before anyone else woke, the air carried a faint, sour note that I associated with a wound I'd had as a teenager, a gash on my shin from a bicycle chain that had gotten infected before my mother noticed and dragged me to the clinic. I didn't say anything immediately. I watched Amara through the morning as she helped Jay organize the new supplies, and I noticed her favoring the arm. Not dramatically. She wasn't wincing or cradling it, but she was using her right hand for everything, even tasks that would have been easier with 2. When she reached for a can on the top shelf, she used her right arm and stretched rather than lifting both. At noon, I pulled Patricia aside. We stood in the laundry room, door closed, speaking in voices barely above breath. "How did she cut it?" I asked. "A chain-link fence. We were climbing over it behind the school. Her sleeve caught, and the metal sliced through. I saw it happen. Has she cleaned it since?" Patricia's silence was its own answer. "We need to look at it," I said. "She won't let you. She's afraid of what you'll think." "I don't think anything. A cut is a cut. But if it's infected, medically infected, we need to treat it before it becomes something worse." Patricia looked at me, and in her gaze, I saw a woman who understood perfectly well what I was really asking. She was asking it herself, had been asking it since the moment the gauze went on. The question wasn't about medical infection. The question was about the other kind, the kind that turned Mrs. Calloway into a thing that moaned at the sky. "I watched her get cut," Patricia said, each word placed with precision. "There was no bite. There was no contact with any infected person. It was a fence." I believed her. I did. But belief and certainty occupied different rooms in my mind, and the hallway between them was getting longer every day. We approached Amara together. She was sitting on the couch, reading a paperback she'd found on my shelf, an old thriller with a cracked spine. When Patricia sat beside her and gently took her arm, Amara's body went rigid. "It's okay," Patricia said. "We just need to clean it." I unwrapped the bandage slowly. The gauze was stuck to the wound in places, and Amara inhaled sharply when I peeled it free. Beneath it, the cut was real. A 3-inch laceration across the outer forearm, consistent with the jagged tear of chain-link metal. The edges were red, swollen, and weeping a thin, yellowish discharge that confirmed bacterial infection. I'd taken a wilderness first aid course 2 years ago for a hiking trip I'd never taken. And the course had covered wound care in enough detail for me to recognize cellulitis when I saw it. "This needs antibiotics," I said. "We don't have antibiotics," Nolan said from the doorway. He'd been listening. Of course he had. "The pharmacy on Crescent Drive might." "That's 4 blocks, open street. We've done 3 houses. This is 4 blocks. 3 houses in an alley with fences and cover. 4 blocks on a main road with intersections and sight lines. It's not the same calculation." He was right. I knew he was right. But I also knew that an untreated infection in a world without medical infrastructure was a death sentence delivered slowly. And I wasn't prepared to watch that sentence be carried out on a 23-year-old woman who'd done nothing wrong except climb a fence too quickly. I cleaned the wound with hydrogen peroxide. Amara gripped her mother's hand and made no sound. I applied fresh gauze from the first aid kit, wrapped it tightly, and secured it with medical tape. It was a temporary measure, a finger in a dam. That evening, the 5 of us sat in the living room in candlelight and had the conversation we'd been avoiding. Nolan laid it out with his teacher's clarity. We were on day 4. Supplies would last maybe 6 more days with strict rationing. Water pressure was gone entirely. We were living off the bathtub reserve. The radio broadcast had stopped. No helicopters had passed overhead. No military vehicles had appeared on the street. The evacuation points it had mentioned were fictional until proven otherwise. "We have 3 options," Nolan said. "Stay here and stretch our resources until they run out. Go house to house and scavenge until every house on this street is empty, or leave. Head for Greendale or wherever the evacuation is actually happening, and try to get there alive." Jay spoke first. "We don't know what's between here and Greendale. That's 40 minutes by car. On foot through infected territory with a wounded person? That could take days." "Staying could take longer," Nolan replied. Patricia hadn't spoken. She was looking at Amara, who was looking at the floor. "What do you want to do?" I asked Amara directly. She raised her head. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the crystalline focus of someone who had processed their fear and arrived at something harder on the other side. "I want to live," she said. "I don't care how." The room absorbed her words. They were the simplest thing anyone had said in 4 days. And they cut through every argument, every calculation, every strategic debate like a blade through smoke. We were no longer discussing options. We were deciding whether to survive passively or actively. I told them about Ellen, about Greendale, where the power was still on and the windows were boarded, about Tom, who knew how to build things and fortify them. It was 40 minutes by car. On foot, moving carefully, it might take 8 to 10 hours. We could leave before dawn, travel in low light, and reach the edge of Greendale by afternoon. Nolan unfolded a road map he'd found in the Henderson's glove compartment during our scavenging run. He spread it across the floor and traced the route with his finger. Residential streets to the highway on-ramp. Then a 2-lane service road that paralleled the interstate, then country roads into Greendale. The service road was the problem. It was exposed, flat, and offered no cover. "Unless we take the rail corridor," Jay said, leaning over the map. "The old freight line runs from the industrial district south of here straight through to Greendale. It's below grade, lined with trees, and nobody uses it. I used to jog along it." We looked at the map. The rail corridor was there. A thin, dashed line cutting diagonally across the landscape. It wasn't direct, but it was sheltered. We agreed. Dawn, the rail corridor, Greendale, all 5 of us. I blew out the candles and lay on the floor in the dark, listening to 4 other people breathe, and tried to imagine what the morning would ask of us. We left at 4:50 a.m., before the sky had decided whether it was night or morning. The light was gray and indeterminate, the air cool and damp, and the street was empty in a way that felt less like safety and more like a held breath. I carried the backpack with food, 2 water bottles, the first aid kit, and the hammer. Jay had the chef's knife and a second pack with the remaining canned goods. Nolan carried the radio and the crowbar he'd taken from my garage. Patricia held Amara's good hand. Amara held nothing. Her injured arm was pressed against her body, and she moved with a careful economy that told me the wound was worse than she was showing. We crossed the backyard in single file and entered the alley. The gravel was loud under 10 feet, and I winced at every step. Jay led because he knew the route to the rail corridor, and I brought up the rear, walking backward every few paces to check behind us. The alley ran for 2 blocks before opening onto a cross street. Jay paused at the opening and scanned. "1," he whispered, "far left, facing away." I moved to his shoulder and looked. An infected man, maybe 60 yards away, standing beside a mailbox at the far end of the block. He was motionless, his head bowed, as though he'd walked to the mailbox to check his mail and forgotten what he was doing. We crossed the street quickly, staying low, moving in the shadow of a parked SUV. The infected man didn't turn. We reached the opposite alley and continued south. The rail corridor entrance was behind a chain-link fence at the edge of the industrial district. A stretch of warehouses, auto repair shops, and a lumber yard that had been half abandoned long before the outbreak. Jay led us to a section of fence where the bottom had been peeled up, likely by joggers or teenagers, and we slipped under one at a time. Patricia struggled with the clearance, and Nolan held the fence while she crawled through. Amara went last, protecting her arm, grimacing when the ground pressed against the bandage. The corridor itself was a revelation. Below the street grade by 8 or 10 feet, lined with oaks and maples that had grown wild over decades of disuse. The old freight line was a tunnel of green and shadow. The rails were still there, rusted, buried under years of leaf litter and weeds. But the gravel bed provided a clear path, wide enough for all 5 of us to walk abreast. The trees formed a canopy that blocked most of the sky. From above, from the streets, we were invisible. For the first hour, we walked in silence. The only sounds were our footsteps, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional distant crack that could have been anything out. Laying a branch, a gunshot, a door slamming in a vacant house. We moved at Amara's pace, which was slower than I wanted, but faster than I feared. Patricia stayed beside her, and I noticed her whispering occasionally. Encouragements, directions, prayers, I couldn't tell. At 6:30, we stopped to rest in a cleared area where the corridor passed beneath a road overpass. The concrete structure provided shelter and shade. Jay distributed water. 2 sips each, rationed with a precision that would have been comical in any other context. I ate half a granola bar and gave the other half to Amara, who took it without protest. Nolan turned on the radio. Static across every frequency. He tried for 5 minutes, cycling through bands with the methodical patience of a man who believed that persistence was a form of optimism. Nothing. He turned it off and set it down. "The broadcast stopped," he said. "Maybe the transmitter lost power," Jay offered. "Maybe. Or maybe there's no one left to broadcast." The statement landed in the group like a stone in still water. Nobody argued. Nobody offered an alternative explanation. We sat under the overpass and let the possibility settle. That the infrastructure of response, the assumption that someone in authority was managing this, might have been a fiction we'd been telling ourselves. I looked at the 4 people sitting around me. Jay, picking at the label of a water bottle. Nolan staring at the radio. Patricia, rewrapping Amara's bandage with fresh gauze from the kit. Amara, watching her mother's hands with an expression that mixed tenderness with something I recognized as guilt. The special guilt of the person whose injury becomes the group's burden. "We keep moving," I said. "Greendale is real. My sister is real. Her husband is real. The power was on 4 days ago, and 4 days isn't long enough for everything to fall apart everywhere." I didn't know if that was true, but I said it with enough conviction that 4 heads nodded, and we stood and we walked. The corridor carried us south through the back edges of Ridgemont, behind shopping centers, beneath highway overpasses, alongside drainage channels that ran dry and cracked. We saw evidence of the infected from below. A car had crashed through a guardrail above us, its front end hanging over the embankment, its interior dark. A shopping cart had rolled down the slope and come to rest against the rail bed, filled with canned goods and bottled water that someone had been transporting before abandoning. We took the water, 3 bottles. Each one felt like currency. At 9 a.m., the corridor was blocked. A freight car sat across the tracks. An old rust-brown boxcar with its doors sealed shut and weeds growing through its wheel assemblies. It had been there for years, a relic of the corridor's working days. But the growth around it was dense. Bushes, vines, saplings that had colonized the space between the car and the corridor walls, creating a barrier that we couldn't simply walk around. "Over," Jay said, looking at the boxcar roof. "We climb over." The roof was 8 feet above the ground. Jay went first, pulling himself up by the grab irons on the side, and reached down for Nolan. Nolan climbed. I boosted Patricia, who moved with more agility than I expected, and Jay and Nolan pulled her up. Then Amara. She couldn't use her left arm. I lifted her by the waist while she gripped the grab iron with her right hand, and the 3 above pulled her onto the roof. I was the last one up. Standing on the boxcar roof, I could see above the tree line, for the first time since we'd entered the corridor. The view stole my breath. Ridgemont stretched to the north, and from this elevation I could see columns of smoke rising from at least 4 different locations, spaced across the city like signal fires. The highway was visible as a gray ribbon, and on it, vehicles sat bumper to bumper in both lanes, a frozen river of metal that had stopped flowing and would never resume. The sound of the city, which should have been a constant, low roar even at this distance, was absent. Ridgemont was silent and burning. I stood on that boxcar and looked at the place I'd called home for 11 years, and I understood with a clarity that felt like a blade that I was never going back. We dropped down the far side of the boxcar and continued south. The corridor narrowed, the trees pressing closer, the canopy thickening, until we were walking in a green half-darkness that smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. Nobody spoke about what we'd seen from the roof. Nobody needed to. The smoke, the frozen highway, the silence. These were not images that required commentary. They were evidence, and we absorbed them the way you absorb a verdict. Around 10 a.m., Jay stopped walking. He held up his fist, a gesture he must have learned from a movie, but it worked, and we all froze. "Listen," he said. I heard it. Below the ambient rustle of leaves, below the soft rhythm of our breathing, there was a sound. Rhythmic, wet, persistent. It was coming from ahead, maybe 30 yards, around a gentle bend in the corridor where the tree line curved to follow the old rail path. Jay moved forward slowly. I followed. Nolan stayed with Patricia and Amara. We rounded the bend and found it. An infected woman was crouched beside the rail bed, hunched over something on the ground. She was wearing athletic clothes, leggings, a tank top, running shoes, and her ponytail was still intact, held by a blue elastic band that was such a normal, human detail that it made everything else about her worse. Her hands were pressed against the ground, and the wet sound was coming from her mouth, which was working mechanically against the surface of whatever she was focused on. I couldn't see what it was, and I didn't want to. Jay and I stopped. The woman hadn't noticed us. We were downwind. If wind mattered to them, and the bend in the corridor had kept us out of her visual range. I grabbed Jay's shoulder and pulled him back slowly. We retreated to the group. "One infected ahead," I whispered. "Occupied. We can go wide through the trees, come back to the corridor past her." "Or we wait," Nolan said. "She might move. She might not. And every minute we wait is a minute we're standing still in the open." We went through the trees. It was harder than it sounds. The underbrush was thick, the ground uneven, roots catching at our ankles with the tenacity of something deliberate. Patricia stumbled once, and Nolan caught her arm. Amara moved in grim silence, her jaw set, her breathing controlled. We gave the infected woman a wide berth, 50 yards at least, and rejoined the corridor on the other side. Nobody looked back. By noon, the corridor's character had changed. The trees thinned, the grade leveled, and the landscape opened into farmland, rolling fields that had been planted with something green and uniform, now untended and growing wild. We were outside the Ridgemont boundary. The air smelled different, cleaner, agricultural, free of the faint, acrid tinge that had clung to everything in the city. We stopped in the shade of a water tower that stood beside the corridor, its ladder rusted, its tank adorned with the name of a town I didn't recognize, painted in faded blue letters. Jay distributed the last of the water, half a bottle each. I drank mine in small sips and felt each one travel through me like a message of reassurance, from my body to my brain. Amara sat down in the grass and pulled up her sleeve. The bandage was soaked through, not with blood, but with the yellow discharge I'd seen before, darker now, and carrying a smell that made Patricia turn her face away. I knelt beside her and unwrapped it. The wound was worse. The redness had spread beyond the laceration's borders, creeping up her forearm in streaks that followed the paths of superficial veins. The skin around the cut was hot to the touch, swollen, and the discharge had thickened. This was no longer early infection. This was cellulitis advancing towards something systemic. And without antibiotics, the next stage was blood infection. And the stage after that was one I couldn't allow myself to name. "How far to Greendale?" Amara asked. Her voice was calm, but her eyes searched mine for something more than distance. "Maybe 4 hours, maybe 5. "I can make it. I know you can." She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. And in that moment, something passed between us that I've never been able to adequately describe. It was recognition, not of each other, but of the situation we shared. We were two people in a field beside a rusted water tower, one of us wounded and one of us carrying a hammer. And the gap between those two positions was narrower than either of us wanted to acknowledge. I dressed the wound with the last of the clean gauze. I used the hydrogen peroxide sparingly. It stung, and she gripped the grass with her good hand until her knuckles whitened. I wrapped it tighter than before, hoping pressure would slow the spread, knowing it probably wouldn't. We resumed walking. The corridor carried us through fields, past abandoned farm equipment, alongside drainage ditches, where frogs sang with an obliviousness that felt almost offensive. The world was ending, and the frogs didn't care. I envied them their simplicity. At 2 p.m., we encountered our second cluster of infected. 3 of them, standing in the corridor itself. 2 men and a woman, spaced roughly 10 yards apart, motionless, facing different directions like broken compass needles. They were between us and the next section of tree cover, and going through the open fields to bypass them would leave us exposed and visible from any direction. Jay looked at me. Nolan looked at me. Even Patricia looked at me. And I realized with a sinking feeling that somewhere in the past 4 days, I had become the person who made decisions. Not because I was qualified or brave or particularly smart, but because I owned the house where this group had formed. And ownership had been silently converted to leadership. We walked through, I said. Slowly, quietly, single file. Don't run unless they move toward us. If one reacts, we split. Jay and I draw them off. Nolan gets Patricia and Amara past. Nobody argued. We formed a line. Jay first, then me, then Amara, then Patricia, then Nolan. We entered the corridor at a pace that was half walk, half crawl, or each foot placed with deliberate care, each breath measured and shallow. The first infected was 15 yards to our left. He didn't move. The second was 10 yards to our right, facing away. The third, the woman, was directly ahead, and as we approached, she turned her head slowly in our direction. We stopped. She looked at us, or looked through us, with eyes that were open but unfocused, pupils dilated to the point where the iris was barely visible. Her mouth opened. She inhaled. For 3 seconds, I was certain she would moan, and the moan would activate the others, and the corridor would become a trap. She exhaled, turned her head away, resumed her blank, directionless stare. We passed within 5 yards of her. I could see the veins in her neck, could smell the sour, biological scent that clung to all of them. We kept walking. We didn't run. We emerged from the corridor's exposed section into a stretch of oak trees and kept walking for another quarter mile before anyone spoke. That was the worst 2 minutes of my life, Jay said. Nobody disagreed. Greendale appeared in stages. First, the cell tower, visible above the tree line at 3:30 p.m., its red light blinking. Powered, active, impossibly normal. Then the water treatment facility with its circular tanks, operational, the faint hum of machinery audible from half a mile away. Then the houses, arriving in clusters, their windows intact, their yards untouched, some of them, unbelievably, with lights on behind their curtains. The transition from the dead zone to the living one wasn't gradual. It was abrupt, almost violent in its contrast. We walked out of a stretch of corridor that had been silent and abandoned, and into a neighborhood where a generator hummed behind a chain-link fence, and a dog barked from a yard, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from a chimney. It was late April, and no one needed a fire. But someone was burning one anyway, and the reason was obvious. The fire was a signal, a declaration, a refusal to go dark. Jay stopped at the edge of the corridor and looked at the houses. His eyes were wet. He wiped them with the back of his hand and said nothing. Nolan set down the crowbar and placed his hands on his knees and breathed. Patricia held Amara's face between her palms and pressed her forehead to her daughter's. And for a moment they stood like that, 2 women holding each other up, and the world contracted to the space between them. I pulled out my phone. It had died hours ago, but the portable charger had given it a partial resurrection. And now, within range of the cell tower, a single bar of signal appeared. I called Ellen. She answered before the first ring completed. "I'm here," I said. "I'm at the edge of Greendale." 5 of us. She made a sound that wasn't a word. It was the vocal equivalent of a dam breaking, a release of pressure that had been building for days. I heard Tom's voice in the background, asking questions, and Ellen answering in sentence fragments. "He's here. He's okay. 5 people. Coming now." She gave me directions to their house, though I knew the route. 3 blocks east, right on Elm. 4th house on the left. The one with the green shutters and the workshop in the back. I'd been there 100 times for barbecues and Thanksgiving dinners and lazy Sunday afternoons watching football in Tom's living room. We walked through Greendale, like ghosts, discovering they were still alive. The streets were not empty. People moved behind windows, and 2 men stood on a corner talking in low voices, watching us pass with expressions that balanced sympathy and suspicion. We looked like what we were. Refugees from the other side of the line. Dirty, exhausted, carrying weapons and canned goods and the haunted posture of people who had seen things they weren't ready to speak about. Ellen was standing in the driveway when we arrived. She ran to me and wrapped her arms around my neck. And for a moment I was 12 years old, and she was 15, and we were hiding in the closet during a thunderstorm that had knocked a branch through our parents' bedroom window. She'd held me then the same way she held me now, with a ferocity that contained protection, relief, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the danger wasn't over, but at least we were together. Tom emerged from the house and assessed the group with the practical eye of a man who built things and understood load-bearing capacity in both structural and human terms. He shook hands with Nolan and Jay. He looked at Patricia and Amara, saw the bandage, and said, "Let's get inside." The house was fortified. Tom had boarded the ground floor windows with plywood, reinforced the doors with steel brackets, and installed a generator in the workshop that powered the essentials: lights, the refrigerator, a single space heater. He'd filled every container in the house with water before the pressure dropped. He'd organized food into a storage system that would have made a logistics professional nod in approval. Ellen had printed informational sheets from the internet before the connection died. First aid guides, maps, radio frequencies, water purification methods. They'd been preparing while I'd been surviving. The difference was stark and humbling. Amara was taken to the kitchen table, and Ellen, who had been a nursing assistant before switching careers, unwrapped the bandage and examined the wound with steady hands. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her jaw tighten. "This needs more than peroxide," she said. "Tom, the medical kit, the antibiotics." Tom had antibiotics. Of course he did. Tom had everything. He'd purchased a veterinary-grade antibiotic supply months earlier, during a period of mild prepper enthusiasm that Ellen had teased him about, and I had politely ignored. He returned with a bottle, and Ellen calculated the dosage based on the printed guide. And Amara swallowed the first pill with a glass of water that came from a tap that worked, in a house with electricity, surrounded by people who had not given up. I stood in the doorway of Tom's kitchen and watched this, and something inside me released. Not the tension. The tension would live in my shoulders and my jaw for months. But the specific corrosive fear of being responsible for outcomes I couldn't control. That eased. I was no longer the decision maker. I was no longer the one standing between survival and disaster. I was a person in his sister's house, watching a stranger receive medicine, surrounded by walls that held. The first night in Greendale, I dreamed of the corridor. In the dream, it was endless. The rail bed stretching to a vanishing point beneath a canopy of trees, the gravel crunching beneath my feet in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. There was something behind me. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there the way you know someone is watching you in a dark room, through a sense that has no name but never lies. I walked faster. The corridor didn't end. I woke with my hand around the hammer, which I'd set beside my pillow. The guest room was quiet. Thin morning light came through the plywood-covered window in slats. I could hear Tom moving downstairs, the measured footsteps of a man who rose early because early rising was a form of vigilance. I dressed and went down. The kitchen smelled like coffee. Tom had a percolator on the camp stove. The generator powered the lights and fridge, but they were conserving fuel, so the electric range stayed off. He poured me a cup without asking. We stood at the counter in silence and drank, and the silence was comfortable, the way it is between two people who understand that words are sometimes an intrusion. "How bad is it out there?" he asked eventually. I told him. I told him about the power dying, about the figure on the Hendersons' lawn, about Mrs. Calloway in her nightgown, about the back gate, about Jay's arrival, about the scavenging runs, about the route through the corridor. I told him about the infected woman crouched over something on the ground, and the 3 figures in the corridor, and the smoke rising from Ridgemont. I told him in flat, sequential language, the way you describe a trip to someone who wasn't there. This happened, then this, and I watched his face remain steady through all of it, absorbing the information without performance. "Greendale's better," he said, "but not safe. We've got about 300 people in this pocket. A few retired military, some medical. The power's holding because the substation here is independent. Solar backup installed 2 years ago. But the infected are at the perimeter. Not many, not organized, but more every day. Are people working together? Some. There's a loose council forming. Mostly the louder personalities, which is always how it works. They're talking about rationing, patrols, a medical station. It's functional but fragile. Jay came downstairs next, then Nolan, then Patricia and Amara. The antibiotics had started their work overnight, and Amara's wound, while still angry, showed the first microscopic signs of retreat. The redness had not advanced, and the discharge had thinned. Ellen checked it with careful fingers and redressed it with clean bandages from a supply that Tom had organized in labeled bins. Over breakfast, powdered eggs, canned fruit, instant coffee for those who wanted it. We talked about what came next. Not in the urgent, desperate tones of the last 4 days, but in the measured, constructive language of people who had reached temporary safety and were now trying to convert temporary into permanent. Nolan wanted to contribute to the community defense. His analytical mind and teaching ability made him a natural fit for organizing. And by midday, he'd introduced himself to the informal council and was helping map the perimeter and identify weak points. Jay volunteered for scavenging runs, leveraging the skills he'd developed in Ridgemont. The quiet movement, the environmental awareness, the ability to enter a house and strip it of useful supplies in minutes. Patricia, who had been a school administrator before retirement, began organizing the medical station with the 3 registered nurses who'd survived. Amara rested. Her body needed it. The infection was responding to antibiotics, but the wound was deep and the recovery would be slow. She sat on Tom's porch in the afternoon sun and read another book from my shelf. I'd brought 3 in my backpack, a decision that had seemed absurd at the time and now felt prescient. I found my role on the second day. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't leadership or combat or anything that would translate into a compelling story. I became the person who maintained the generator. Tom taught me the mechanics, fuel mixture, filter maintenance, output regulation. And I tended the machine with a devotion that surprised me. It hummed in the workshop, producing the electricity that powered the lights that kept the darkness out. And in caring for it, I was caring for every person in that house. It was a small thing. It was everything. On the third evening in Greendale, I sat on the back steps of Tom's workshop and watched the sun go down behind the trees. The sky was clear. No smoke on the horizon, at least not from this angle. A dog barked somewhere, and a child's laughter, the first I'd heard in a week, drifted from a house down the block. I let the sound wash over me, and something tightened in my chest, not with pain, but with the particular ache of receiving something you'd been denied. Amara came and sat beside me. Her arm was in a sling now, fashioned from a scarf Patricia had found in Ellen's closet. She didn't speak for a long time. We watched the colors drain from the sky in real time, orange to rose to violet to the deep, undifferentiated blue that preceded night. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door. You would have done the same. Maybe. But you did it when you didn't know what we were, when we could have been anything. You opened the door anyway. I thought about this." She was right. In that moment on the second day, when Nolan had stood below my window and asked for shelter, I'd made a choice that could have ended differently. I could have stayed silent, could have watched them walk past, could have preserved my supplies and my safety and my isolation. Instead, I'd opened the garage door and let 3 strangers into my life. And those strangers had become the people who walked beside me through a freight corridor past the infected, who shared water under overpasses, who held each other's hands in the dark. "I was afraid," I said. "I want you to know that. I wasn't brave. I was afraid, and I opened the door anyway. And I'm still not sure if that's the same as courage, or just the absence of anything better to do." She smiled. It was the first smile I'd seen from her, and it changed her entire face, lifted the exhaustion, softened the guarded edges, revealed the person who existed before the outbreak had forced her into survival mode. "That's exactly what courage is," she said. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were days. Individual, specific, often tedious days, filled with tasks that were repetitive and essential and boring. I maintained the generator. I helped Tom reinforce the perimeter fence around our block. I learned to purify water with bleach. 8 drops per gallon, let stand 30 minutes, pour through cloth, and taught others the same. I attended council meetings where arguments about resource allocation became heated and personal and eventually productive. I cleaned, cooked, repaired, and repeated. The infected remained at the edges. Patrols reported encounters daily, 1 or 2 at a time, rarely more, always manageable. The retired military personnel, 3 men and 1 woman who had served in various branches, established a rotation system. They didn't carry guns. Ammunition was scarce, and gunshots attracted attention. But they carried tools, machetes, bats, crowbars. The encounters were brief and grim and necessary, and the patrol members spoke of them rarely. Jay became one of the best scavengers in the community. He moved through the surrounding neighborhoods with a speed and silence that earned him a reputation. He returned from runs with backpacks full of supplies: food, medicine, batteries, tools, clothing, books, always books. He'd learned from Mrs. Patterson at the food bank that people need more than calories. They need occupation, distraction, the particular comfort of someone else's story when their own has become unbearable. Nolan transformed. The cautious, authoritative teacher who'd argued about rice portions in my kitchen became one of the most effective organizers in Greendale. He mapped resources, tracked population, mediated disputes, and maintained a ledger of supplies that was updated daily and posted publicly. Transparency, he said, was the antidote to hoarding. When people could see the numbers, they trusted the system. When they trusted the system, they contributed to it. Patricia ran the medical station with a quiet, immovable competence that brooked no argument. She organized shifts, maintained hygiene protocols, and managed the dwindling pharmaceutical supply with the precision of someone who understood that every pill was irreplaceable. Amara joined her as soon as the wound healed. 3 weeks of antibiotics and careful cleaning, and the two of them became the medical core of a community that was learning, day by imperfect day, how to sustain itself. Ellen and Tom anchored the household. Their marriage, which I had sometimes regarded with the faint condescension of the contentedly single, revealed itself as a load-bearing structure. They divided labor without discussion, supported each other without performance, and maintained a home that functioned as a haven for 7 people without ever making anyone feel like a guest or a burden. Tom fixed things. Ellen fed people. Together, they held the walls up. Marcus Oyalaran, arrived on foot 3 weeks after we did. He'd walked from his apartment 50 miles east, sleeping in abandoned cars, drinking from garden hoses, carrying nothing but a phone with a dead battery and the unshakable conviction that if he kept moving west, he'd find me. He showed up at Tom's door at noon on a Tuesday, thinner than I'd ever seen him, with blisters on both feet and a grin that split his face like a sunrise. I embraced him on the porch, and the hug lasted longer than any hug between 2 men who'd been friends for 15 years and never spoken about the depth of it. He smelled like sweat and road dust and survival, and when he pulled back, his eyes were full. "I told you to come crash at mine," he said. I laughed. It was the first real laugh. Not a nervous exhale, not a polite acknowledgement of irony, but a full, unguarded laugh. Since the power went out, it felt like a door opening. The weeks became months. The months settled into a rhythm that was not normal. Normal was gone. Normal was a word from a language we used to speak, but was something adjacent, functional, sustainable, alive. We grew food in the yards. We bartered between households. We taught children in the church basement. We mourned the dead in ceremonies that were improvised and sincere. We built, slowly, imperfectly, with arguments and setbacks and occasional grace, something that resembled a community. The infected thinned. Whether they were dying on their own, migrating, or being cleared by forces we couldn't see, their numbers diminished. The patrols reported fewer encounters. The perimeter held. The generator hummed. The water ran. The world was smaller, harder, and stripped of every comfort that had once made it bearable. But it was still the world, and we were still in it, and that, just that, was enough. I still checked the locks. Every night, before I allow myself to sleep, I walk through the house and test every door, every window, every latch. Tom installed proper deadbolts months ago, and the plywood came down when the perimeter patrols proved reliable, and the windows show open sky and streetlights powered by solar panels that Tom and Nolan rigged together from salvaged equipment. The neighborhood is quiet. The quiet is real now. Not the absence of something terrible, but the presence of something earned. Sometimes I stand in the kitchen at dusk and remember the moment the ceiling fan stopped. The knife on the cutting board, the onion half sliced. The silence that arrived without warning and rewrote everything I understood about safety, about solitude, about what it means to be alone in a house when the world outside stops recognizing you as a person and starts recognizing you as prey. I open the door. That's what I come back to. When the knocking came, when the voice begged, when every rational calculation said to stay hidden, I opened the door. And the people who walked through it became the people who saved me. Not because they carried weapons or supplies, but because they carried the thing that the infected had lost and the darkness tried to take. They carried each other. We carried each other. We still do.